Hello, everybody. This is Morgan Ortagus from the Morgan Ortagus Show, and I'm really excited for our very first launch show because we have somebody that is a household name in the United States, somebody who has spent a lot of his career working on national security issues, and that is Senator Ted Cruz. So this show on the Morgan Ortagus Show, we are talking about foreign policy, national security, what's going on around the world. I have some specific policy questions I want to ask you regarding Israel and the United Nations. But before I get into that, can you just sort of explain to our listeners, as somebody who has been an advocate for our ally, the State of Israel, and for the Jewish people, and we just so appreciate your support. Can you describe for us what it felt like for you whenever you learned of the attacks on October 7th and later learned how many Americans were killed as well? What have these attacks meant personally to you?
Well, absolutely. It has been truly horrific. October 7th was one of the most evil and horrific attacks in history. It is October 7th was the single greatest mass murder of Jews in a day since the Holocaust. October 7th was also one of the worst terrorist attacks in history on the United States. 31 Americans were murdered that day. 1,200 Israelis were murdered that day. Over 200 hostages, both Israelis and Americans, were taken that day. Hamas committed horrific atrocities. They sent death squads from house to house to house, murdering every resident, hunting down and killing civilians simply because they were Jewish. They murdered elderly people. They murdered women and children. They raped women and young girls. They murdered infants. It was atrocities of a kind not seen in a long, long time, and it was an absolute manifestation of evil that was grotesque to watch.
Yeah, I thank you for those sentiments. I think it's so important as you hear people calling for a ceasefire, or you hear people argue that there should be a two-state solution, or all these negotiations should happen. I think every time someone calls for a ceasefire, we should remember exactly what happened from those happened on that day with those terrorists, and the stuff that, I mean, quite frankly, it was worse than ISIS. I mean, this is stuff that we didn't even see during the height of the ISIS caliphate in Iraq and Syria. So thank you for those words, Senator. But I also want to talk about UNRWA. And most of our audience is probably listening, may have heard of it, may know that it's a UN agency. It's a UN agency that we, of course, decided not to fund in the Trump administration. But can you think of any redeemable qualities for this UN organization, and why the Biden administration is funding them? And of course, what you think we should do as a policy perspective?
Well, absolutely, and let me say actually at the outset that congratulations on your new show. I'm really glad you're doing the show.
Thank you,
I'm
sir.
glad that your listeners are able to engage in issues of substance and foreign policy at a level of depth you don't get through most media outlets. Most media outlets don't cover the substance, or if they do so only in a very superficial manner. And I think it is important to understand the magnitude of the threats we're facing. Look, UNRWA is the UN agency that provides aid to Gaza. Now, here's the problem. When you give aid to Gaza, Gaza is controlled by Hamas. And so when you send aid to Gaza, you are sending aid to Hamas. When Joe Biden became president early on, I led a coalition of 17 senators calling on Biden not to send aid to Gaza. Why? Because if he did so, that aid would inevitably flow directly to Hamas, and they would use that money to commit acts of terrorism. At the same time that I sent that letter with 17 senators, 150 House Democrats sent their own letter urging the Biden administration to send aid to Gaza, even though they knew that it was likely that would go to Hamas and be used for terrorism. We now know what happened internally as the Biden administration was assessing that question. The Biden administration made a determination that the money was sent to Gaza. It was, quote, highly likely to go to Hamas and be used for terrorism. Now, Morgan, as you know, ordinarily, once that determination is made, that would be the end of the matter. Under existing U.S. anti-terrorism law, if it is highly likely that money would go to terrorism, the U.S. government doesn't send the money. Unfortunately, the Biden administration consistently puts partisan politics and ideological objectives above U.S. national security interest, above the interest of our allies. And so the Biden administration formally waived U.S. anti-terrorism law and sent hundreds of millions of dollars to Gaza, which in turn went to Hamas. And as a very real and practical matter, the death squads on October 7th and the rockets that have been raining down on Israel ever since were paid for by the Biden administration and paid for by your and my taxpayer dollars.
And I think, Senator, that is such an important point that you make here. You know, if you have to, as an administration, if you have to waive your own terrorism laws, your own terrorism regulations in order to send funding and aid, maybe that's not the right approach. And I got to tell you, you know, nobody's heart breaks more than to see innocent civilians, children, women be put in harm's way and be hurt in Gaza. But I can tell you who doesn't care about these innocent children and women, and that's certainly Hamas. They have no intent of protecting this population. You know, I want to move because we are covering national security events around the world, and the most important national security event or issue right now is, of course, what you face in Texas on our southern border. And I was hoping that you could just give us an update on where the Senate is on the negotiations. I know that there is a bipartisan consensus that wants funding for Israel as they go through this fight. However, it doesn't seem like Democrats quite understand the mess that they have created at our southern border. And where are we, sir, on those negotiations?
I think that's exactly right. And let me comment on both of the things you said. I want to start by commenting on what you said about Hamas and Hamas not wanting to protect Palestinian civilians. And sadly, it's even worse than that. Hamas actively wants Palestinian civilians to die. And that may seem like an extreme statement, but it is in fact an accurate statement because Hamas regularly uses Palestinian civilians as human shields. So, for example, Hamas bases their military headquarters in the basement of a hospital. They do so because they want to put the IDF in the Hobson's choice of either not attacking the military headquarters, in which case they can continue to wage war on Israel free of retaliation, or, even better from Hamas's perspective, Israel would retaliate and the result would be dead Palestinians. Hamas likewise puts missiles and rockets in elementary schools and kindergarten classes because their objective, they want dead Palestinian women, they want dead Palestinian children, they want dead Palestinian infants, because when that happens, they know that the useful idiots in the media will happily broadcast those images across the globe. And Hamas knows that it is not strong enough on its own to defeat Israel, but it believes that with the useful idiots in the corporate media, that can undermine and weaken Israel. And so when it comes to Palestinian civilians, understand it is tragic that there are Palestinian civilian deaths. And Israeli Defense Forces go to extraordinary lengths to try to avoid civilian casualties, but the reason there are some civilian casualties is because Hamas wants those Palestinian civilian casualties. Now, you asked about the southern border, and I would say what is happening at the southern border is an absolute crisis and catastrophe, and it is very much intertwined with what's happening in Israel. Since Joe Biden has become president, 9.6 million illegal immigrants have come into this country. 9.6 million, just under 10 million.
Wow.
It is the worst illegal immigration in our nation's history. I spend a lot of time at the southern border. I regularly go out on midnight patrol with the Border Patrol. Every time you go out, you encounter groups of illegal aliens crossing within minutes. The last time I was there just a few weeks ago, the Border Patrol is deeply concerned about Hamas terrorists and Hezbollah terrorists crossing our southern border to carry out acts of terrorism in the United States. I believe, Morgan, today we have a higher risk of a major terrorist attack than we've had any time since September 11th, 2001. And Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they have all called for terrorists to commit the same types of atrocities that happened in Israel on October 7th. They've called for terrorists to commit those same types of atrocities here in the United States. And the Biden administration is willingly opening our border and exposing us to an enormous terror risk that sadly, I think it is only a matter of time before we see American lives that are taken from a terrorist attack that this administration is allowed to unfold.
It's shocking that it hasn't happened yet. I mean, thank God, and we'll pray that it won't. But when you look at the numbers, what you said, almost 10 million that have crossed that border, and we know the Wall Street Journal just had an article about the number of fighting-age Chinese men who were in the groups coming over. We know over 100 countries. We know how many people, hundreds of people on the terror watch list. These are the dumb terrorists that got caught. But I appreciate what you have to say. I hope that you will continue, and I know you will, to fight strong in the Senate against the Democrats who are pushing back for this border funding, because our national security is at stake. But just going back to looking at the Israel issue from the perspective of the United States, one of the things that we've seen, for some reason, people seem to have forgotten that there were over 30, I think it's 33 Americans now killed by Hamas, by these terrorists, one of the top deadliest terrorist attacks against American citizens anywhere in the world. And we still have Americans left behind. By the way, I would remind you, this is an administration that still has Americans left behind in Afghanistan. That happened several years ago. And now there's at least 8 Americans left behind. And what you've seen, one of the troubling things, I think, Senator, as a Jewish American, is to see the anti-Semitism that has risen up on our campuses and our cities. I guess it was there the whole time. I never thought it would be as bad as it is. And one of the things that we saw from that abysmal testimony from the university presidents in the House just a few days ago, the Wall Street Journal was breaking this afternoon that actually the Wharton board, so this is at the University of Pennsylvania, this is their business school, their board is calling for leadership changes at Penn. I think you will probably agree with that sentiment, but what is it like for you, sir, to see these federally funded university presidents come before the House and basically not be able to ensure that their Jewish students will be kept safe?
It was absolutely disgraceful. That testimony was embarrassing to watch. The president of Harvard, the president of Penn, the president of MIT, all three of them could not bring themselves to unequivocally denounce anti-Semitism. All three of them, when asked whether a call for genocide of the Jewish people was harassment, none of them could give a straightforward answer to it. They all hemmed and hawed and said, well, it depends on the context. In which context is calling for genocide, for calling for mass murder, an acceptable position on student campuses? And sadly, the answer is our campuses have been radicalized. Morgan, I have a brand new book that just came out that is called Unwoke, How to Defeat Cultural Marxism in America. And it explains why what is happening on college campuses right now is happening, which is the radical left. They view the world through a Marxist lens, and Marx divided the world into oppressors and victims. And for the radical left, they have defined Jews as oppressors, and they have defined Palestinians as victims. And once they make that definitional twist, the cultural Marxist then supports the violent revolution of the so-called victims against the so-called oppressors. And it's why you see so many leftists cheering on the Hamas terrorists. It's why you see Black Lives Matter across the country celebrating the Hamas terrorists. It's why you see 35 student groups at Harvard saying all of the atrocities in Israel, all of the murders, all of the rapes, all of the children who have been slaughtered is 100% the fault of Israel, because these radicals believe any violence, any atrocity is justified as long as it is carried out by the people they have defined as victims. And so on our university campuses, We are seeing Jewish students being harassed, being threatened. MIT has had Jewish students unable to go to class because they're facing threats of violence. And the MIT administration, bizarrely, not only is not protecting its Jewish students, but has explained that it is unwilling to punish the anti-Semitic protesters who are threatening their safety. Why? Because many of those students are foreigners, and if they were expelled from school, they would be deported. Now, set aside the insanity of saying, oh, if you're a foreigner, it's perfectly okay for you to threaten the lives and safety of fellow students. Listen, anyone who threatens another student should be expelled. That is not acceptable to engage in threats of violence. You look at another school like USC in California. USC literally banned one of its professors, a Jewish professor, from stepping foot on campus. Why? Well, once again, anti-Semitic protesters threatened him. This is an economics professor. And USC decreed that he had to teach the rest of his classes online, remotely. And that's truly insane. Any rational university would say, we're going to protect our professor, we're going to provide security, and we're going to stand against threats of violence. But these universities are radicalized, and I got to say, the three university presidents who testified, all three of them should resign in disgrace. And I will say one final comment on this. Look, October 7th and everything that has unfolded since then has been horrific and truly heartbreaking. But at least two positive things have come from all of this evil. Number one, Israel is working hard and is dedicated to utterly eradicating Hamas. That is a very good thing. That is a good outcome for Israel. It is a good outcome for America. Secondly, in the last 2 months, we have uncovered the vicious anti-Semitism that has been inculcated by radical leftists at our universities. Now, importantly, Morgan, that anti-Semitism was there on October 6th. This wasn't created out of thin air, but what has transpired has uncovered it. It has shown the radicals that we have allowed to be in charge of our universities, and I very much hope that will lead to a change and a return to some semblance of sanity.
That's right. Well, Senator Cruz, first of all, that book sounds amazing. Can you tell our audience the title of the book one more time and where they can find it?
Sure. The book is called Unwoke: How to Defeat Cultural Marxism in America. And you can get it on Amazon.com. You can get it on Barnes & Noble. You can get it anywhere you buy your books. It's a national bestseller, and it's fun. It's interesting. It highlights, number one, how the radical left seized every major institution in America. But number two, it gives a practical battle plan for how we take these institutions back. Because I think if we don't take these institutions back, we're going to lose our nation.
Absolutely. Well, it is my honor on the launch of the Morgan Ortagus Show to have a legend, Senator Ted Cruz from the great state of Texas, on the line. And I do not yet have Christmas presents for my parents, so I don't know about you, but I think I'm going to buy this new book from Senator Cruz and maybe try to get him to sign it, head over to his office. Sounds like a good Christmas present for my dad.
Morgan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is Morgan.
Gift, so I hope they enjoy it.
Thank you, sir. This is Ted Cruz. Thank you so much. Well, everybody, that's it for today on the Morgan Ortagus Show. I hope you enjoyed our launch show. Remember, you can follow me on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, well, now X, and Instagram, at Morgan Ortagus. And you can also listen again to today's show on demand on the SiriusXM app. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Have a great rest of your weekend. I'm excited to see you again next Sunday at 11 a.m. East, right here on the Morgan Ortagus Show on SiriusXM, Patriot Channel 125.